One of my goals is to visit all of the presidential libraries and also the grave sites of all the presidents. And today I'm excited to be in Simi Valley, California to visit the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library. All right, before I actually go into the library, I wanted to show you all the grounds a little bit before, I'm sure we'll explore more later, but the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library is built on top of a hill here in Simi Valley, and the views are just breathtaking. Of course, here we have a statue of Nancy Reagan. And I don't think the camera necessarily does this justice. But this is absolutely beautiful. Probably the most beautiful setting I've seen a presidential library in so far. And another thing looking right over here I thought was kind of cool is a statue of President Ronald Reagan riding a horse. So I'm used to seeing, older equestrian statues with whether it's George Washington on a horse or, something from 18th century, 19th century. So seeing a more modern day president on a horse is pretty cool. Ronald Wilson Reagan was born on February 6, 1911 in Tampico, Illinois. And that's something I didn't know myself growing up in Indiana. That's kind of cool. Right there, another Midwest guy. And this is fascinating. This was his mother's Bible, Nell Reagan's Bible. And it says that at both of Ronald Reagan's presidential inaugurations, he placed his left hand on this Bible. Another thing about Reagan growing up is he was very good at sports and loved to swim and play football. And in high school, he really wanted to play football, but he was only 5'3" and 103 pounds as a freshman. But he was able to make the team by his junior year, and also at Eureka College excelled in both football and swimming. And here they have some of his swimming medals that he won for freestyle relay races in 1931 and 1932. Another interesting thing I learned, kind of talking about his early family life, this is his father, Jack Reagan, and I guess his father was an alcoholic, and he would disappear for days at a time, but his mother, Nell Reagan, told her sons that his problem was not Jack's own fault, and it was a sickness that demanded tolerance, not condemnation. And it's cool, they have this whole center display of his parents and sort of his lineage, talking about how they originated from Ireland. But yeah, young, vigorous man there throughout high school through the 30s. And I read a quote earlier that while the Reagan family were not wealthy in terms of money, they were wealthy in terms of intelligence and learning. And it says here that Ronald received a well-rounded education. He immersed himself into life at college, and he proved, as mentioned, to be an accomplished athlete, actor, and a leader. And we'll talk more about the acting side later, but of course, before he was governor of California and before he was president, he was an actor. This is neat. So what is considered Ronald Reagan's first speech? He was at Eureka College during the Great Depression, and the college president announced plans to cut different classes, lay off professors, and other steps to save money there at the school. And Reagan's classmates chose him to deliver a speech protesting the cuts and calling for a strike. In a quote from Reagan, he said, "Giving that speech, my first, was as exciting as any I ever gave. For the first time in my life, I felt my words reach out and grab an audience, and it was exhilarating." So I think you could probably make the argument that that speech he gave there in college might have been the spark that he needed to ultimately pursue a life in politics. So right after college, Ronald Reagan, with his outgoing personality, landed the job at WWII as a radio broadcaster in Davenport, Iowa. And from there, he moved on to WHO. And what's cool is you can kind of see these stepping stones in his career, because when he was working with WHO, he was an announcer for Chicago Cub games. And when he was working there, he talked the team into bringing him along to spring training on Catalina Island in Southern California. And then in April 1937, he had an old acquaintance in LA, introduced him to an agent, and then ultimately he was able to land a contract with Warner Brothers. And Ronald Reagan always wanted to be an actor, and as we see as he stepped through those jobs at different radio stations, he was able to work his way into Hollywood. So one of Ronald Reagan's nickname is the Gipper, and that really comes from the movie Newt Rockne, All-American, where he played the character George Gipp, and that movie was released in 1940. And over here you can see the sweater that he wore in the movie, but it's a reproduction, but this kind of talks about that. So he starred as a football player, again, George Gipp in that movie, and for the rest of his life, one of Ronald Reagan's nicknames became the Gipper.
Legendary. Ask him to go in there with all that gun. Win just one for the Gipper.
Randy! Randy! Where's the rest of me?
In late 1941, America entered World War II. Ronald Reagan was called to active duty, but his nearsightedness kept him from going overseas. Instead, he was assigned to the Domestic Motion Picture Unit. There, he made and appeared in Army training films, documentaries, and the wartime musical, This Is the Army.
Like other members of my generation, I came home from the war expecting a better world. But I didn't like some of the things I saw after VJ Day. My own industry, motion pictures, was being ripped apart by a bitter labor dispute.
Hollywood was a jungle at the time. The mob was in there, the communists were in there.
In 1946, the Screen Actors Guild asked Ronald Reagan to mediate a dispute between rival unions.
The training ground that was most important to him in being able to learn the art of political compromise was the Screen Actors Guild.
The next year, Ronald Reagan became the Guild's president, where he led the union in several successful contract negotiations.
So, of course, when most think of Ronald Reagan, they think of his wife and former First Lady Nancy Reagan. They were virtually inseparable, and Ronald always felt that their marriage, as he said, quote, was an adolescent's dream of what a marriage should be. It was rich and full from the beginning and has gotten more so with each day. And they were married on March 4th, 1952. And this is a cool artifact I like. It said from 1952 to 1957, Nancy and Ronald lived on Amalfi Drive in the Pacific Palisades. And when they moved, they left behind this heart with their initials in the cement. And 40 years later, the owner of that property later discovered this. So I thought that's kind of cool. This was found all those years later and then brought here to the museum. That's cool. Here's a marriage certificate of Ronald Reagan and Nancy Davis, dated March 4th, 1952. So again, Ronald Reagan was a movie star in those early years, and in 1954, General Electric offered him a new opportunity to get into television. So he agreed to host a new series that presented a drama, comedy, romance, or adventure every week. And depending on your age, some of you may remember these years and Ronald Reagan's involvement with the General Electric Theater. Following his many years as an actor and working with the Screen Actors Guild, Ronald Reagan, of course, for his sort of launching point into the presidency eventually, was his time as governor of California, which he served as governor from 1967 to 1975. and he dealt with a lot of major issues coming into office, one of those being a tremendous debt that the state of California had. Said that he inherited a state government with a deficit of more than $200 million, so he did have to raise taxes in his first term, but also imposed different spending cuts, and ultimately was able to get California into a surplus by 1968. So he undertook a lot of different plans, a lot of different reforms there in California, which ultimately were maybe not initially popular, but brought positive change to the state of California during those 8 years as governor. One other major issue during his time as governor was the energy crisis. And he proposed and supported a lot of different alternate forms of energy, to include nuclear power stations that were constructed, some of those that are still in use today, and also in exploring hydropower. And of course, there were other things such as wind power and other things like renewable energy that came out in the decades to follow. Of course, Nancy Reagan's best known as First Lady of the United States, but before that, she was First Lady of California. And she really took on that role and became a very positive force for good in the state of California. She would visit hospitals and support other programs there in the state that helped wounded veterans, prisoners returning from the Vietnam War, and just other efforts that she did and made as First Lady of California, which undoubtedly prepared her for her later years as First Lady of the United States. They have a lot of cool artifacts and things on display from his time as governor, when he was running for governor. This is a set of POW bracelets. It says 5 million bracelets like these were manufactured and sold to remember American servicemen that were imprisoned or missing in Vietnam. It says Senator John McCain's bracelets on display there. Also see Captain James Stockdale, a few other well-known folks. Of course, Ronald Reagan was known as the great communicator, and many remember him for his wit and some of the comedy that he would bring into speeches. And one of the sources of that wisdom and that wit that he was able to draw from was this book of quotes. So in the 1950s, he started writing down onto note cards different quotes and poems and speeches and things like that, and he kept them here in this notebook. And it says, over the next 40 years, the ideas in this notebook became a valuable resource for his speeches, radio addresses, and letters. So many of his most famous quips and one-liners were inspired by these notes, which also reflect the many sides of Ronald Reagan. When Ronald Reagan finished up his time as the governor of California in 1975, he was able to remain in the public eye. And that's because from 1975 until 1979, he wrote and delivered more than 1,000 radio addresses to a weekly audience across the United States. So he had radio programs. He also wrote newspaper columns, which were published in a ton of different newspapers. So I think his ability to stay in the public eye and remain relevant was directly leading to his time as the president in later years. Of course, there was the 1976 campaign, where Republican leaders urged Ronald Reagan to run against Gerald Ford for the Republican presidential nomination in 1976. And Gerald Ford actually narrowly won that nomination against Ronald Reagan, which maybe in today's day and age is hard to believe, but things were different back in 1976. But that campaign and him, again, gaining more visibility as a public speaker, as a public image, and ultimately as a political leader, directly contributed to his candidacy for the Republican Party for president in 1980.
With a deep awareness of the responsibility conferred by your trust, I accept your nomination for the presidency of the United States.
So in the presidential election of 1980, Ronald Reagan was running against Jimmy Carter. And this geographic map shows the election results. So Reagan won most of the United States, Carter taking a handful of states, including his native Georgia. But Reagan won pretty overwhelmingly in 1980. And here they have the actual outfits that Ronald and Nancy Reagan were wearing on his inauguration day, January 20th, 1981. And again, he won 44 out of 50 states and attracted voters from across the aisle. And it says that he led Republicans to control the U.S. Senate for the first time in 28 years, though Democrats still controlled the House of Representatives and would challenge many of his ideas throughout his presidency. And here we see, similar to his note cards where he kept different quotes and poems, his actual speech cards here. So as with any president, those first 100 days or so, in this case they talk about his first 70 days, are pretty crucial in establishing how they're going to manage the country and their presidency. And Ronald Reagan was big with the economy, on cutting spending, non-essential travel, and kind of dismantling some of the organizations and positions within the federal government that he felt were wasteful spending. And this is cool. They actually have a whole timeline of those first 70 days, his presidency, discussing all the things that he did and enacted, the people he met with. And this is cool. I've always liked timelines like this. Kind of gives you an idea of what led to what, and ultimately, where he got at the end of those 70 days. It's pretty fascinating. So on his desk in the White House, Ronald Reagan had two plaques, which are both right here. The one in the back, the red one, it says, "It can be done." And the smaller one here in the front reads, "There's no limit to what a man can do or where he can go if he does not mind who gets the credit." That kind of gives a good framework of Reagan's mindset as he was pushing through into the presidency, hoping to make change. Of course, one of the most famous events of the Reagan presidency was the assassination attempt against him, which took place on March 30th, 1981, only a few months into his presidency. And a man named John Hinckley fired 6 shots and not only hit the president, where a round got lodged into his lung, but also wounded several others. And he was eventually rushed to the hospital. And what's amazing is here on display, other than the video of the actual assassination attempt, is his new blue pinstripe suit, which he was very excited about and very excited to wear. And today you can still see the bullet hole and traces of blood there on his suit. Of course, being the man that he was, he tried to allay fears while he was on the operating table and made some funny quips, such as "I should have ducked" to his wife Nancy, and also asked and hoped that the doctor was a Republican. So even after getting shot and being a lot closer to death than most people realized, Ronald Reagan was able to keep things light there in the room. But again, the round stopped less than an inch from his heart and lodged in his lung. And it says the day after, or actually the day that he got shot, he had lost more than half of his blood. So he was a lot closer to death again than most realized. But thankfully he survived. And his suit is on display here, which is just quite amazing. And they also have this video with a reenactment of his surgery and everything going on.
Breathing through an oxygen mask, the old performer entertains the hospital staff.
The president jokes to tell was very obvious to everybody.
And as mentioned, others had gotten shot as well. 3 other men, U.S. Secret Service agent Timothy McCarthy, policeman Thomas Delahanty, and White House Press Secretary James Brady, all survived, but many of them with debilitating injuries that they suffered with for the rest of their lives. But they do have get-well canes that were given to the president, and of course his famous red sweater that he wore over a bulletproof vest when he finally emerged in his first public appearance following the assassination attempt. Of course, a president is best known for their Oval Office and how they decorate it. And for Ronald Reagan, he had a lot of Western motifs that you can see throughout. A lot of things with cowboys and horses, which is cool, kind of an ode to his early years as an actor in Westerns and his love for the West. And I also like that they have that portrait of Andrew Jackson and then the one of George Washington above the fireplace there. Very classy, very simple, but definitely very much Ronald Reagan. So talking to the gentleman here about what in this room is original, the chair behind the desk Ronald Reagan used during his 8 years as governor and his 8 years as president. And the photos on the table behind the desk are original, what he had on display in the White House. And all the little bronze statues you see off in the distance were original, as well as the books. But everything else is essentially a reproduction. But this is exactly how the Oval Office would have looked in 1989, prior to him leaving office. All right, the next exhibit after the Oval Office recreation is more about his time in the White House with some more artifacts. That's pretty cool. This is the Reagan Diary. It's a 5-volume set covered from January 20th, 1981, so his inauguration, until January 20th, 89. And it looks like here is one of those 5 volumes. His handwriting, not as good as I anticipated. I don't know what I was expecting, but it's kind of funny to see some other interesting artifacts that would have been on his desk. It says these desk accessories were in his private office on the 2nd floor of the White House. This is a really, really beautiful and well put together presidential library. This is interesting. So this is known as the Eagle Podium, and this historic piece of furniture has been used in the White House State Dining Room for years, and it became a popular White House fixture just because it showed up in so many photos. And what I find really fascinating is this right here is the original, and it states that the podium currently used in the State Dining Room is in fact a reproduction of this one right here. This is awesome. There's this massive pavilion built onto the side of the library that has Ronald Reagan's Air Force One suspended in it. This is one of the coolest things I've ever seen at a library or museum. What's really amazing, I'm sure maybe I'll read about it here at some point, is how in the world they got this huge aircraft all the way up here in the mountains. Because as you can see there, the views, which are breathtaking, we're way up here on a mountaintop. So that'd have been quite the mission. But this is unbelievable. Here's just a little bit of history about this specific aircraft. This is a Boeing 707, and it was accepted into the Air Force on August 4th, 1972. And although it's here at the Reagan Presidential Library, it was actually used as Air Force One by 7 different presidents: Nixon, Ford, Carter, Reagan, H.W. Bush, Clinton, and George W. Bush. So the Reagan Library received this aircraft, number 27000, in a decommissioning ceremony on September 8th, 2001 at the San Bernardino International Airport. And now did learn how they got it here. So it was disassembled. So did learn about how it got here. It was disassembled over a 9-week period by a 9-person crew from the Boeing company. And on June 21st, 2003, it was transported here to the library by trucks that were specially designed to carry this. Went over 104 miles, and they took the roof and 2.5 walls of the pavilion, or prior to that being built rather. It was towed inside here on September 20th, 2004. So, and they built the remaining walls around the aircraft. So I guess that answers how they got this massive aircraft up here on top of a mountain. Okay, here we are going into Air Force One. Of course, the cockpit here, pretty tight squeeze. Quite a few seats in there, looks like 5. I'm sure they have a lot of extra controls and other things going on in here since it's for the president.
They've got way more stuff than this. And actually, this is old stuff. This is like from the mid-90s. Okay, yeah, this is mid-90s. Actually, some of this...
Like a command center in the sky, sort of, like this area. Cool, thank you. So here we have where the president himself would have sat, of course, with his jar of jelly beans there. It's a nice little setup.
Okay, this little galley is where they take care of the president, the first lady, and the other people.
Here's another view. See Nancy Reagan's Air Force One jacket there. Looks like this was possibly where the First Lady would have sat, sort of her little office and lounge area where President Reagan's would have been up forward. It's kind of a photo of them on the couch there. More jelly beans over there, something Ronald Reagan was known to love. Yeah, with how everything's oriented in here, quite a bit of space actually compared to what it looks like on the outside. So the last section in this one, all for like staff, the president. It's kind of cool how they have this all sectioned off as you go further back. And this next section would have been for the Secret Service. So a little less posh, but actually still pretty comfortable. These tables, I think it's cool that these sides actually fold up for meals and can fold down for more leg room. More seating. I believe he said if there was any media on board, they would be back here towards the back of the plane. Probably why that camera's there. I would also put the media in the back if I'd even let them on the plane. So just finished walking through Air Force One, and it's kind of cool. When you're done with most of the exhibits, you're already on kind of the second floor where you can enter the aircraft there. You exit there at the back, and then when you come down here, you can go see some of the vehicles and Marine Force One. Now we have a series of vehicles. It's kind of cool. It talks about just a little bit about the history of the presidential motorcade. In 1907, U.S. Secret Service agents in a motor vehicle followed President Teddy Roosevelt's horse-drawn carriage, ushering in the era of presidential motorcade. It's a beefy little Silverado. Oh, check that out. That's cool. Look at the license plate. I don't think it actually said that on there. It looks like they added it when it came to the library, but there you go, the Gipper. So this is President Reagan's Cadillac limousine. It says this 1984 Cadillac limousine was state-of-the-art when the Secret Service had it built exclusively for presidential transport. President Ronald Reagan was the first to use this vehicle, beginning with the celebration of his 73rd birthday in his hometown of Dixon, Illinois. And when you go down one more level, there is Marine One. I think earlier I called it Marine Force One, like an idiot, but this is Marine One. This is a Sikorsky VH-3A. It was delivered to the Army in 1962. It said that it wore Army markings early in its service since both the Army and Marine Corps flew executive transportation helicopters. That's kind of cool. In 1975, the VH-3A helicopters were replaced with VH-3D models, which are still in use today. And this is on loan from the National Naval Aviation Museum, and it's been on display inside the pavilion since it opened in 2005. Once you're done checking out Air Force One and Marine One, the exhibits actually continue to go through the rest of the Reagan presidency and his later years. Of course, a lot of major events occurred during his presidency, one of the biggest being the tearing down of the Berlin Wall and some of the famous quotes that came out of that from Reagan. So they have this exhibit that goes into behind the Iron Curtain, Soviet Union, and also the ultimate taking down of the Berlin Wall. These exhibits continue on with, again, some of the major events going on during his presidency, from Lebanon and everything that went on in Beirut to things in South America, Central America. And it's cool. These are more going into, again, more modern times, but a lot of this history and divided political and social history that a lot of people either lived through, if you're watching this and you're older, or if you're somebody like me who was born right after the end of Reagan's presidency, something I kind of learned in school and am growing up learning more, especially as we seem to repeat history around the world, as is often the case. One of the most famous events of Reagan's presidency occurred between Soviet Union and the United States, and out came his quote, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." So between Geneva and Washington, they had multiple summits where Reagan worked alongside Gorbachev, or at least worked with him, to come up with a nuclear deal, along with ultimately reuniting Eastern and Western Germany. And this is a cool display. I'm actually learning a lot here about the different summits and everything and how it played out. And they have these cool full-size bronze statues of Reagan sitting down with Gorbachev. And this is probably my favorite room here. We all know Ronald Reagan loved the American West and ranching and everything such. So he bought his first ranch property in the 1940s. Over the years, they grew to enjoy the pace of life on their family ranches. So even during his time in the White House, made sure to make a trip out to the ranch or a weekend to Camp David just to get outside and get away from it all. And this display is really cool. Just goes into, again, a lot of the Western history and the Western things that were part of Reagan's life, which is really neat. That is cool. That Smith & Wesson .44 Magnum revolver is engraved with President Ronald Reagan's signature and images of his life and presidency. It says it was a gift from Leopold J. Dieters to the president in 1984. Of course, some of the belt buckles and saddles. That is awesome. And again, the president loved being outdoors, so he spent time at Camp David when he could, and that kind of served as a sanctuary for him and the First Lady. On Saturday, June 5th, 2004, President Ronald Reagan died. And President George W. Bush declared June 11th, 2004 National Day of Mourning. All right, just finished up with all the exhibits inside, and that was a wonderful experience. And before I leave, I just wanted to come check out a few of the things that are here on the property, and of course, the final resting place of Ronald and Nancy Reagan. And if you can't tell, it is extremely windy out here, all the way up here on the mountaintop. But out here, they have an engraved copy, really, of the Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, the Bill of Rights, and Civil Rights, which is always cool to see. And over here, I was admiring these younger trees, and this is known as Gipper's Grove. And I'm not sure what year these were planted, but got a nice grove of trees. Again, right here on the side of this mountain. And if we go over here, you'll see this curved stone wall with the hedge on top. And this is the final resting place of Ronald and Nancy Reagan. Ronald Wilson Reagan died on June 5th, 2004, and Nancy Davis Reagan lived over another decade and passed away on March 6th, 2016. And both are buried here with their feet pointing towards the ocean. And I really like that quote back there. It says, "I know in my heart that man is good, that what is right will always eventually triumph, and there is purpose and worth to each and every life." All right, that's where I'm going to leave you all. I had an incredible time exploring the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and the grounds. I learned a lot about Ronald Reagan, his life, his presidency, and a little bit more about those influential decades that he was coming up and getting into American politics. And he was definitely president at a very monumental time in our history, from 1981 to 1989. And his presidency and his influence has meant a lot to many Americans. I'm sure if you were alive during his presidency and remember those years well, you were either a big Reagan fan. Some of you may not be. I think, particularly in today's political climate, perhaps Reagan's legacy might fall on one of two sides. But either way, if you ever get a chance to come out here and visit, you're going to learn a lot about American history, a lot about the man who Ronald Reagan was, and hopefully a little bit about yourself along the way too, when you look at these very divisive moments in American history and world history, and what our role has been throughout all of that, throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. So it's been a great visit. I thoroughly enjoyed it, but that's going to be it for this one. Now it's on to the next journey.